So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session that will take us far beyond the sound or the bounds of our atmosphere into more of a domain where the possibilities are limitless, but the challenges are equally vast. So our topic today is Beyond the Stars, Competition and Collaboration in Space Diplomacy. And we will try to dive into a space race unlike any we've seen before. So no longer is it simply a contest of technological superiority or national prestige, but today's space race is set in an arena where diplomacy, science, and international collaboration meet. So it's a place where dreams of exploration intersect with the realities of geopolitics. So the global space economy is expanding drastically at an unprecedented pace. We have estimates suggesting that it will surpass $1 trillion by the 2040s. Yet we rush for space resources, and the emergence of new actors and the dual-use nature of space technology make this frontier fraught with both opportunities and risks. In this session, as we mentioned, we'll try to explore how space diplomacy can drive a more tech-driven and interconnected world while also balancing the aspirations for scientific progress with the potential for manifestation and conflict, militarization and conflict. We'll also delve into how the legal frameworks we create now will actually shape the future of space, whether we see it as a realm of cooperation or competition. And to guide us through these crucial discussions, we are privileged to have with us His Excellency Salem Butti Qubaisi, Director General of the UAE Space Agency. We have Professor Giovanni Zanalda, Director of the Rethinking Diplomacy Program at Duke University. And we have here James Revill, Head of the WMD and Space Security Programs at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. And last but not least, we have Dr. N. Janardhan, Director of Research and Analysis at AGDA. And I forgot to introduce myself as well. My name is Ricard Jalkebro. I'm an Associate Professor also at Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. So without any further ado, I'll throw out the question. We decided to go with one mic, so we'll be passing it around for now. There will also be an opportunity for you, the audience, to ask questions. If you look behind you on this wall here, there's a QR code, so feel free to scan that and type in your questions. There will also be on this screen a bit later on during the discussions. And I will help. They will pop up on the screen here, so I will try to keep an eye on the iPad and ask the questions for the audience. Right, so just to throw in a softball to start the discussion, get things going, I'd like to ask you, how can space diplomacy better promote the tech-driven world?
Thank you, Dr. Jalkebro. And thank you to the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research and the Anwar Gargash Diplomacy Academy for having organized this very interesting summit. And thank you for being here. So this is, of course, it's a very important question when we talk about space and space diplomacy. And I would like to add to that having participated in several sessions throughout yesterday and this morning of the plenary session, it's interesting that space came up several times in several sessions, sometimes directly, so space was named, space. Other times the technologies were mentioned, some technologies that have to do with space, but they didn't say space directly. Why I'm saying this? Because if you go through the program for this summit, we have geotech, geoeconomics, and geopolitics. Space and space diplomacy encompasses all of them. So this is really not unprecedented because there are other areas that are similar, but space diplomacy and has been growing very quickly, partially because of technology, partially because there are more and more countries participating in the space diplomacy, space economics, and also in this case geotech. And the other point is that the emerging technologies, so going to your point, have been changing so rapidly, and they enable the rise of what you mentioned, the global space economy, which is in 2023 was around $600 billion US, which is the same valuation of the semiconductor global semiconductor sector. And the projection now, there are different projections, but actually, I think it's probably going to be 1.8 trillions by 2035 or 2040, according to, in this case, to McKinsey and World Economic Forum. So it's very important to understand that we are witnessing something unprecedented when we talk about space. It's accelerating thanks to technology and thanks to more actors are part of the game. And that is why space diplomacy is becoming vital, because space diplomacy has to, like diplomats should do, to balance different forces that are emerging very rapidly. And when with the speed of change is so fast, it's very difficult to adapt institutional frameworks that keep up with the changes or changing technology. Now, the interesting thing about space diplomacy in the last 10 years is that there have been initiatives that are trying to respond to this change or rapid change. And I will get to that. And this is necessary because if we go back to the origin of space diplomacy, was the signing of the Outer Space Treaty in 1967. And it's still a very interesting treaty and it's still in force, but definitely in 1967 the world was completely different, not only from a geopolitical point of view, but also especially from a technological point of view. So space diplomacy there have been other conventions that have been updated, etc. But the Outer Space Treaty still is the core of the space diplomacy world. Now, there are new initiatives, like the Artemis Accords, and we will talk about that later, that are trying to take into consideration all these new advances in technology and at the same time to influence not innovation, but try to direct a certain type of innovation in a way that is going to support the main goal, that is to have a sustainable space, and also from both from an environmental point of view, but also from a safety point of view. We will get to security issues later. So your question about technology is crucial. Without new technologies, without advances technologies, we will not be here about space diplomacy as if it's one of the most important areas of diplomacy. The other, and then I will stop here, but the other part is that space diplomacy and technology are also connected because of science diplomacy. So science is informing diplomats, so scientists are advising diplomats, and technology is mainly produced and developed by private sector. So we also have the role of private sector is changing the way we think about diplomacy. So we have the UN, of course, we have nation states, we have private sector, and then we have space agencies that play another major role when we talk about space diplomacy. Space agencies, some have been around for some time. Others have been created in the last 10, 15 years. So we have, I think, 77 space agencies nowadays. Some are, of course, more developed than others. But they play a major role because they are trying to work with the private sector, at the same time to advise governments, and also promoting collaborations among themselves. So when we think about technology, the technology is disruptive in a positive way, has changed the way we think about diplomacy when we think about space diplomacy. It's also true in other areas. We heard about AI, we heard about digital technology is something that certainly digital diplomacy has changed in the last 10 years. But space diplomacy, we are really at the forefront, in a way, of a world that is changing by the day because of technology. At the same time, there is a way to influence the application and the use of technology. There are also examples of collaboration and cooperation, and again, we will go back to some examples later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Giovanni. Thank you, everybody who's joining us today. Thank you for the organizer for this chance to be here today and speak on this important topic. I would start where Dr. Giovanni mentioned critical technologies. With the world order that we all know, the only way I see that we can make real difference globally is taking a liberal approach, where institutions are empowered, norms are set, and the art of space persuasion diplomacy is mainly used. And this is a vital kind of baseline for us at the agency. And this is what our approach is. We believe in collaboration, in cooperation, collaboration. And we see the value in that in our programs and projects that we have already in line, as mentioned, some in the previous panel or in the main hall. So how can we do that? That's probably the most important question. In my views, is by further fostering international partnerships in space research or space exploration, enabling the sharing of knowledge, enabling the sharing of technology and resources. And that's a vital importance. Space business is not cheap. And there is no one nation can do everything that aspires to. Collaboratively, however, there is a way for us to achieve it. And there are many examples that one can talk about showing the value of that. The most prominent one is the International Space Station, where it brought in, at the apex of the Cold War, all the side polar kind of nations together for a project that encompasses global goals and for the betterment of humanity, regardless of nationality, borders, and specific national interests. The other one is a key area to focus on is by setting standards, which is an important issue. For better collaboration, we need to talk the same language. And that's one of the weaknesses I see evident in general space technology and science, that there needs to be standardization of ways of doing business, ways of exchanging data, making norms are accessible for every nation who aspires to have partake in the space frontier. And I emphasize frontier, not a front, because I'm a firm believer that we have to keep space a peaceful use of space for the betterment of mankind. And to give an important example is the Artemis Accord, where the UAE was on the table, as a nation, developing the Artemis Accord in its inception, because we believe in the importance of having a collaborative work, addressing, we took on our part the responsibility for future emerging nations who wants to aspire have, projects on the moon. So an Artemis Accord, developing the guideline, the peaceful use of the future of the exploration of the moon is important. Expanding access to space as well and technology. And this is, making sure that emerging nations also have an opportunity. I commend the UNUSA on specifically on this, because there are many platforms, projects that it makes available for emerging nations to partake, to help in the development and establishment of their space programs. The other thing is, well, I mentioned the sharing of data. The most prominent example here is ESA's Copernicus program, which makes available space data for everybody to address important, vital, global issues, environment change, climate change, environment monitoring, and that's a really important factor. Creating new economic opportunity as well, and there are many examples of that I will try not to go further, but I would love to mention also where space diplomacy was exercised with the UAE in the HOPE project. As you might know, the launch time was during the pandemic. The world was in lockdown, but through space diplomacy, we managed to collaborate successfully with our US partner and with our Japanese partner. The HOPE probe made its way from the Northern Hemisphere in the Northern continent in the US all the way to Japan and Asia during a global lockdown, and met the critical time window that we had to make sure that we reach orbit insurgence successfully with the HOPE probe. Thank you.
Yeah, Ricard, thank you for moderating this session, and good morning, everyone. Let me try and approach your question in a slightly different way by trying to make a distinction between the space programs of the West and the East, and why has that happened and how has that happened. I think clearly from what we've been hearing over the last few hours, space diplomacy falls within the gamut of the intersection of technology and international relations, which has been discussed so much since yesterday, more now than ever before. And as much as it is a necessity to advance space exploration, I also think it's sometimes a dangerous game because you need to know your limits, because human beings are very greedy. We are constantly trying to reach to areas after exploiting what we already have. And perhaps we are already looking at space as some sort of plan B or planet B, because we are already having missions to Mars, perhaps life in Mars at some point in time. So we need to be careful. And this reminds me, I don't know how many of you listen to rock music. There's a Pink Floyd song which says, "Hey, teacher, leave those kids alone," right? So I sometimes like to change those wordings and say, "Hey, people, leave that space alone." But specific answer to your question, I think space programs in the West were more about conflict than cooperation. I think because it began in the era of the Cold War, it was more about one-upmanship. It was US versus Soviet Union, and more about a demonstration of hard power. I think there was very little use of soft power, except in terms of each one of them parading their achievements in different parts of the world. Largely, it was demonstration of hard power. But I think in the East, we are beginning to see space programs be used largely for cooperation, at least so far. We see very little of competition more in the soft power domain, but definitely not yet in the hard power domain. And a classic example would be China's Beidou GPS system, which is all about rolling it out in the Belt and Road Initiative countries, and as well as the UAE's Mars mission, India's UAE's Mars missions, all of them having some sort of contribution, not only in the neighborhood, but the world at large. And most of the Asian countries have been using satellites as diplomatic tools. I think this really is the key for socio-economic benefits. I think coming from the global south, we are cognizant of the problems that we have, and we are looking at using technology, space technology in particular, to solve the problems that we have on the ground. everything today is related to technology, right? Whether it's direct-to-home television, internet, teleeducation, telemedicine, disaster relief, agro and fishing, natural resource mapping. All of these are critical technologies that are required for the growth of our developing countries. And I think we need to use this more to, through our space programs and enhance the global south to a large extent. But while all of this is very positive, there's a flip side as well. I mean, because digital economy is gaining in currency, satellites are a key component of keeping this economic activity robust. Which means that space is going to become very congested and contested as we move forward. Because we have mushrooming of satellites in this arena, in the space. I think just in the last 20 years, we have perhaps doubled the number of satellites in space from roughly about 5,000 to about 10,000 at present. So this is something that we need to really watch out for. And so there would be more need for cooperation in this sector. And we'll have to wait and see if this will continue to be a cooperative mechanism or reach a point of contestation. But there are plenty of examples already in terms of North-South cooperation. There has been plenty of examples in terms of South-South cooperation in the space programs domain. Apart from what we have seen in terms of US-Russia competition, there's now US-China competition as well. It's beginning to heat up in a sense. And the classic example, you just referred to the International Space Station, run by a host of countries, by nearly 100 countries, with, of course, the US in the lead. But US has not allowed China to be part of ISS. So there lies a problem for the future. And this is where I think we need to understand that we are entering a flat world. Technology, space programs are not really the preserve of just the Western world anymore. China has got its own space station now, right? And guess what? Most of the manuals are in Chinese. So they don't want to really allow the rest of the world to use it unless you're willing to learn Chinese. The Europeans have been quick. They're beginning to learn Chinese to make use of it. The Americans have been stalling the process. So I think this will go on for some time. And there are also signs of competition and cooperation among private firms, because space programs were earlier the preserve of just the public sector, the governments only. But increasingly now we've seen, what the American Boeing company couldn't do, you have Elon Musk pitching in now to bring back astronauts from space. So we are beginning to see those sort of dynamics come into play. And finally, we are also beginning to see some signs of competition in the East as well. And this is, again, just in the realm of soft power with a host of countries. It's South Korea now, Israel, Iran has its nascent space program. Turkey is now competing with the other Asian countries. And you also have a situation where China is beginning to help Pakistan. India is trying to help Vietnam. So these sort of geopolitical issues are beginning to play a role in the space programs of the world as well. I'll stop there and I'll take on the next set of questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Rickard. I hope people can hear me. Please do wave at me or gesture if you can't. I also wanted to take the opportunity to thank our hosts and the organisers of this event. It is truly a pleasure and a privilege to be able to join, and it's been a really interesting discussion, so thank you. I'm conscious of the time, so I'll keep my remarks brief and focus on the first question, Rickard. To do so, though, I think we do need to have some context. As other colleagues have pointed out, we're seeing really fundamental change, both in quantitative and qualitative nature of how the space environment is functioning. Certainly, we have a significant increase in the number of objects in space, but also the number of actors and the type of actors that are operating in space, with the growth of the private sector particularly significant. One thing I would add, though, which has perhaps not been discussed as much so far by colleagues around the table, is that we're also seeing in parallel a growth in interest in counter space technologies, sometimes referred to as weapons, but not necessarily in the UN context. So I'll stick with counter space technologies or capabilities. These are technologies, assets which can be used against space objects or the components of a space system with a view to deliberately denying, disrupting, damaging, or destroying that system, in some cases reversibly or irreversibly. This is, if I may push back just gently on your earlier comments, this is something which is not unique to the West. I think many countries are looking to explore counter-space capabilities for their national security interests. And I think it really does echo the point that you raised, that we're increasingly seeing a space environment that is both getting more and more congested, but also more contested. I'd also add this environment that we're talking about is extremely fragile. If we see an accident or the deliberate use of a counter-space object, it can have significant long-term effects on the space environment, potentially denying us access to the space. And that's important because so many of the systems that we increasingly rely on in our daily lives fundamentally depend on space. If you look at things from the area of communications, energy services, finance, emergency and humanitarian measures of operations, all fundamentally depend on these. Indeed, I think about 40% of the targets underpinning the Sustainable Development Goals rely on Earth observation or navigation satellite systems. So my response to the first question is that when we talk about space diplomacy, it's important not just to promote the technology. That is clearly important. We need to continue to promote space technology. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we shape the way these technologies are used to ensure that we have a safe, a secure, and a sustainable space environment for this and future generations moving forward. And there is much that can be done unilaterally or plurilaterally, but I think we also need to recognize that some of these challenges are so big, we require global, collaborative, multilateral approaches to dealing with them. And I think Your Excellency, you raised several of these points before in terms of tools such as data, improving interoperability of data sharing, building transparency and collaboration. I think that's particularly important. In the sense you have collaboration helps with transparency, but also build trust across political borders, which is incredibly important. And then there are normative and legally binding measures I think we need to continue to explore. But I'll stop there. I'm conscious of the time. Back to you, sir.
Well, thank you all for your question, answering the questions. I think you all tap into something that I was thinking about as well, and it was mentioned in the previous session as well, that we need to look back because snippets and what you're mentioning is, so should we basically consider outer space again as the common heritage of mankind? Because you mentioned the greed, you mentioned the peaceful and the equitable aspects of this. And again, it brings back the whole UNCLOS discussion and the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, right? That Pardo and this idea that, and also if we then accidentally release these counter strikes or something happens with debris, etc., it could cause obviously chain reactions in that sense. So it brings into another question: is so can space diplomacy be apolitical?
It's a very interesting question, because I think we should think about apolitical at the international level, apolitical at the national level. And I think this is important, especially when we look at, for instance, the US, and I will tell you more about the US. But at the international level, you mentioned the Law of the Sea Convention. There have been other examples, like Antarctica Treaty from 1959, and then ratified several times. Those are good examples of treaties that have, especially the Antarctica Treaty, has worked pretty well until recently. But in the case of space, what we see is that apart from the UN approach, we have these new frameworks. His Excellency has mentioned the Artemis Accords. So the Artemis Accords are accords that were launched in 2020 by the US with a couple of other countries. Now there are 44 countries, including the UAE, part of the Artemis Accords. But on the other hand, you have Russia and China that have created a International Lunar Research Station, which is another type of agreement. These are non-binding agreements, so this is important to keep in mind. But at the same time, they are very important fora for conversations and dialogue among the different members of in the case of the Artemis Accords, to talk about what to do once we are going to the moon. So there are issues about property rights that cannot be. We cannot have property rights on the moon because of the OST convention treaty. Sorry, and but there are issues related to the extraction of resources that are in a sort of gray area, but they are allowed by national space policies. And apolitical, if at the international level, it seems that there is, again, a reflection of geopolitical tensions. We have two large coalitions. Well, the Artemis Accords are 44. The other coalition are, I think, 11 right now. So it's smaller, but still it's very relevant, given especially the presence of China and Russia. So when we think of apolitical at the international level, I'm not sure that we are in that situation. But when we think about all countries want to do the same thing, so they are interested in sort of sustainability and peaceful use of space. On the other hand, when we get to resources extractions, then there is going to be competition. So there is where, again, a sort of gray area. Now, at the national level, space is one of those, at least in the US, it's one of those few areas where there is, I would say, not full, but pretty close to full unanimity among the different parties. And a good example of this is that, think about that President Obama passed the 2015 space law, which is really the very important law for when we think about space laws in general. President Trump there is an executive order, President Trump 2020, and then recently Vice President Kamala Harris, who is the chair of the National Space Council, signed another agreement that is very relevant for, again, both parties. So there is no really competition, or it's apolitical in this sense. Another good example is the space debris issue in the US. Senate passed the Orbits Act, that is basically about space debris, in 2023, unanimously. It was sent to the House and is still there, but not because of political divisions. It's because there are other issues related to the fact that the House would like to have a more comprehensive plan and at that point include the Orbits Act in that plan. The White House has another plan. So it's not because of political differences, but it's really about bureaucratic or fighting, or in this case about having a different or more comprehensive reform. But so I would say it's apolitical, at least at the national level. It's probably apolitical also at the international level in terms of the goals, but it becomes political, if you want, because of geopolitical tensions. Thank you.
Well, that's a tough question. Well, a space agency, we strive, I'm sure it's all the space agency, if I may speak for them, we strive to be apolitical. But it's quite a challenge, because we are part of a government and we work underneath national strategies, and we have our own priorities, national interests. Space exploration, space technology is often linked to many aspects, the gentlemen have alluded to, but security, technological advancement, even national pride, which is an important factor, which I think was the main initiator of the explosive exploration back in the 60s between Russia and the US, who will reach the moon. National pride had a major role in it. So we're dealing with the fact that countries may prioritize space initiatives that advances their own national interests, which is legitimately so. Now, the challenge will become is we live in a very different geopolitical kind of landscape where those interests may be affected by the geopolitical landscape and may make you more, political than you want to be. So many space technologies, to add to the fact that many space technologies are dual use in nature. So it's an issue that even exacerbates the problem. Even though we're trying to advocate for the peaceful use of space, we are faced with this dilemma. So what is the solution? To me, it's through space diplomacy. We need to make sure that we are collaborating. We need to make sure that we try to find, common grounds between different nations with different political priorities and agenda. While we project, that geopolitical tensions may affect this, we have to realize this, and it doesn't make our jobs easy. So at the bottom line, I would say that space diplomacy aims to focus on peaceful, scientific, cooperative, collaborative uses of space. It is inevitably shaped by the political realities that we live in, that nations' interests are going to be taken in consideration, and it's affected by the global power of the world. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Your Excellency. You are from the Space Agency, and I'm from the geopolitical world. So the short answer to your question is, I think it can never be apolitical. Because anything that involves power, profit, interests, security, all of this, money, can never, ever be apolitical. At the end of the day, diplomacy will trump national interests, and there will be competition eventually. And we must also recognize that what rules do we adhere to? We are referring to space as global commons. Right now, as I said, because it's not contested and because it's not congested, we are able to agree on some basics. We are able to cooperate, but we have already seen competition, as I mentioned before. But what rules are we going to talk about? We keep referring to rules-based order when it comes to geopolitical and geoeconomic issues. Whose rules are these? How long have they lasted? Should they continue in the same form? Who sets the agenda? Why should everybody else follow a set agenda? Will everybody get a seat at the table to set the rules of the future of space diplomacy? I think all these issues will become contested as we move forward. There are more, buds of cooperation at this point in time, but increasingly we will begin to see that there would be competition and perhaps even some sort of a conflictual relation. We have seen that partnerships change, alliances change based on interests, and even if we are currently working on a host of issues together, I suspect that we will face the same sort of reality in space diplomacy as we did on geopolitical and geoeconomic issues. But as long as we have a working formula to maneuver around some traffic signal somewhere up in space as well, perhaps we'll be able to move along.
Thank you. I would think I'd agree with the professor here that the short answer to the question from at a multilateral level, I think is sadly no. I think diplomacy at the multilateral level is rarely going to be apolitical at the best of times. And I think now space security diplomacy, like many other forms of diplomacy, is increasingly under pressure and facing a hyper-politicization and increased polarization. In the case of space security, there is a particular division around whether we should take a politically binding approach or a legally binding approach, which has become really quite deeply entrenched and challenging in terms of moving that forward. But I would echo the point that so many of the challenges that we're facing are so significant that I think we really do need to find ways to overcome this collectively. I think trying to build common ground around priorities, around how we perceive threats and risks, and as you mentioned, to make sure that we take into account the interests of all states in doing so in an equitable manner, I think is really important. I would also add that when we're looking at trying to have regulations or governance tools, we aren't starting from scratch. We have the Outer Space Treaty, there are long-term sustainability guidelines, we have launch notification requirements. So part of the challenge is to make sure that we implement those things which are already agreed and then build on those foundations moving forward to make sure that we keep on top moving forward. And that does, as you say, needs to be done reflecting the interests and the views of all states will be extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you. We've been getting some questions from the audience here as well. So I thought perhaps we can direct one to His Excellency. How is the UAE collaborating internationally on its space programs, and what is it looking for in potential partners?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. It is an important question. One of the values that we firmly believe as an institute in the space agency is the importance of international collaboration. We understand that it takes, the initiative from the other side to be willing to collaborate for any collaboration to be formalized. And that's the major role that we are trying to play in our space diplomacy. So we're advocating what are the good things that we've done. We are advocating on sharing of how we build our strategies, how we formulated our laws, how we are approaching and developing and fostering a space industry, which drives, which is a priority for any nation that is aspiring to. And that's kind of the measuring stick that we're playing, trying to put. In return, we're trying to also see what are the gaps that we identified, and hopefully we can find in our potential partner. And that's kind of the umbrella approach that I would say, but I have real life examples on this. The latest project we're undertaking with a plethora of partners here locally and internationally is our mission, Emirates mission to explore the asteroid belt. From the success we had in the Hope probe, we took this further, challenged ourselves to do this, to go further, but also to foster more international collaboration. And here we're the ROI, I would say, it showed itself. In this mission, we have more than 3 contributed instruments, which are major instruments to the mission itself. Before, it was all done by the UAE. Now we're seeing international engagement. Italy is part of it. US is part of it. And more collaboration, trust that we have forged with our international collaborators and globally have paid the dividends in our project today. And that goes all over the value chain of space, from upstream, downstream, and midstream as well.
Thank you. Let's see, we have other questions here from the audience. Let's see. Okay, so we can feed into. It says the person asking the question says, "I'm not worried about government's competition in space, but I'm worried about major cooperation that can advance significantly in 50 years and exploit space without any control body/regulation in space. How can we safeguard our space?" Which leads us into the question again with the dual use and also some, because you all mention it, this collaboration, it's cooperation in space that's necessary. And we've discussed some of the frameworks or the treaties, etc. What else in terms of legal frameworks do we need to implement in order to be able to safeguard these or our space, as the person's asking? Anyone willing to?
Well, thank you. There is no one for approaching this, but there is kind of a pragmatic way of trying to solve the solution. It says countries, nations need to be responsible. They need to take a step forward to addressing this issue. And I'm proud to say that our space law talks about this, talks about mining in space, talks about resource and to try to put a legal framework to be responsible, not just to ourselves and our ambitions to explore the space, but it's also to showcase that this are the values, this is what we have for our international partners in general.
Thank you. I would like to add something. I think that the issue of national space laws is very, very relevant, because think about that right now, there are basically 4 countries that have sort of new space laws. The US, 2015, Luxembourg, 2017, UAE, 2019, and Japan, 2021. There are similarities. They all address the issue of space extractive activities on celestial bodies, and then the idea of licensing. So these are very important laws because they are pushing the private sector to follow laws in this case, and asking for licenses. And then, for instance, in the case of Luxembourg, the licenses expire after a certain amount of time. But the next step would be for other countries to have their own space laws. Sorry, I forgot to mention that the European Union is going to pass a space law sooner or later. It was postponed. The passage of the law or the approval of the law was postponed last April because of the elections in the European Union. And so I don't know whether it's going to be this year. I cannot say because I'm not responsible for that. But anyway, there have been a lot of discussion, and they were close to be close to the vote. But anyway, so the European Union, and that is a major step, because the European Union, in this case, will not only will enforce the laws for all the member countries, but because of the standardization that is often the case when we talk about Europe or the European Union, is going to have an impact on other countries, because in order to work with European Union's space ferry nations, other countries will have to follow the same process of standardization. Otherwise, we would not be able to work with those members. But there is another step that we should take. It's harmonization, because it's important at the national level, but harmonizing these national laws at the international level will be the next step, because otherwise, sure, we are talking about large countries. We are talking about the UAE, a spacefaring nation. Japan, of course, is very important. Luxembourg is important for different reasons. But still, we need to have more countries having their own space laws, but also harmonizing them. And they are very similar, so it shouldn't be too difficult, but we'll see.
Thanks. I should point out, when we look at national or domestic space laws and regulations, I think we sometimes underappreciate the scope of what has been achieved around the world. We have a space security portal in which we try to collect examples of national legislation and regulations strategy. And it's really quite impressive. I think we sometimes don't take that fully into appreciation. So it's not the Wild West, either at the domestic level or indeed at the multilateral level. But I do think there is more we can and should do. And I think we need to do this with a degree of urgency as well. So a couple of things I think moving forward is making sure that we have a shared understanding, or at least recognize different perceptions of the threat and the risk. I think that's certainly important. We need to build mechanisms for better communication in space so that we can operators can signal what their space objects are actually doing, and we can avoid the potential for miscommunication or misunderstanding as to the intents as well. Then I think moving forward, building transparency, building understanding of what objects are there for, what policies are, so we can try and at least mitigate some of the concerns that might emerge from that security dimension. And then moving forward, better ways to monitor and manage a growing body of space traffic to make sure that there is that understanding. We can always avoid accidental collisions as well. And then I think moving forward, trying to have a system of verifying activities in space. And then that could be used to verify either normative measures or a combination of normative or politically binding measures and legal measures in the future. But I think there is a lot that can be done to create this web of prevention from the weaponization of space, which we need to look at further. I'll stop there, but thank you.
Yeah, let me be a bit of a contrarian again, and I'm a realist. Let me not be a pessimist, but let me be a realist. I think, look, let's try and compare problems that could arise in the space diplomacy arena in terms of what we are already seeing in the geopolitical arena or in economic diplomacy or just global warming, right? I mean, we've known that there is going to be a problem. We've been cognizant of it. We've been taking mitigative measures and adaptability measures. But is there cooperation around the world? No, because the world is not equitable, right? So how can you frame any sort of rules where everybody will agree on something as a common rule? Because there are those who have the haves and there are those who have nothing. The have-nots exist as well. So can you arrive at some sort of a compromise in terms of those rules? It's going to be extremely difficult. I think that's where the onus really lies on the Western powers. Because if they are going to continue to be protectionist, as they have been in the geopolitical arena or in the economic domain, then there is going to be a sort of pushback from the rest of the world. So the onus really is on the West. If it is not going to change in the geopolitical and geoeconomic arena, it's already beginning to see that it's having severe problems. And if they don't accommodate the rest of the world, the global South, in their agenda for the future, then the global South will drop its own norms. And you will begin to see a whole lot of minilateral or multilateral sort of cooperation mechanisms come into play. You will begin to see the formation of new clubs playing one against the other. So I think the best way to try and see how we are going to stop these problems 50 years hence is perhaps to start now by giving in more than taking from others.
Thank you, Doctor. Very important point. And that's just, drive us back to the first question where the importance of space diplomacy resides. The emerging nations, emerging spacefaring nations, developing space nation needs to work together to make sure that we are, reaching to a point where there is a common ground for more effective, as we mentioned, framework for everybody to work. And that's only going to be built by trust, sharing of knowledge, and sharing of technology and data. And that's an important enabler. The only, I would say a silver lining all of this, the tempo is different. Dealing with space, we are dealing with a faster tempo. I'm optimistic. I'm sorry, not pessimistic. Optimistic to see that we will see something that will transpire in the near future, not as long as it took, some of the other, kind of things that happen in the world. And the future is bright.
Sorry, I would like to add something to this. I agree, because one thing about space diplomacy that is sort of particular relevant is that when we talk about crisis, of course, there are some mechanisms in place that deal with current crisis. Unfortunately, there are no mechanism to deal with other type of crises like space debris. I mean, we all know that we have a crisis. We all know that there are some ways that we can do something better than what we are doing now, but there is no sort of binding international mechanism right now that pushes all countries to participate in the cleaning of the LEO, at least. So this is when we talk about space diplomacy for current crises. There are discussions. In some cases, there are also successes. But about the long-term view, I agree. At the same time, space diplomacy right now is at the sort of infancy, or at least the infancy of what the space is becoming. And there are opportunities to work on future problems, and there is where we really need having scientists, engineers, so STEMs, working on, or astrophysicists who know more about what potential future problems are going to be, and working now in order to prevent those problems. Of course, once crises are solved before they become crises, nobody's going to say thank you, but that is what we want, right? So I think that space diplomacy has that potential. Current crisis, fine, but it's really think about future crises. And given the space is a very harsh environment, but there are people like astrophysicists, astronomers, and other scientists who can predict certain problems, and that is where we should act. And the other area that is not so far away is the extractive activities on the moon. So sooner or later, some countries are going to be able to settle on the moon and starting extractive activities. And they are all going to be in a very small area, which is the south pole of the moon. And because of the international agreements, nobody can own the moon, but there are ideas of having safety zones. But safety zones are not well defined yet, but there are no mechanisms to enforce not to trespass. I mean, who is going to enforce it if there is not a mechanism? So that is where diplomacy, that is a problem that is not, again, it's probably 5-10 years, probably not even. So those are, and we know that it's going to be the case. In fact, part of the Artemis Accords is to study what to do in terms also the safety zones. There is a precedent with the Antarctica Treaty that is about zoning, because the Antarctica also, no country can own Antarctica, but they can use Antarctica for scientific purposes. And so there are these zoning rules that have worked in the past, and so that is a possibility.
Well, thank you. I like that the future is bright. Before we run out of time, I would like to bring back to these... So based on our discussion, what would be the top 2 or top 3 recommendations that we can propose to advance space diplomacy and promote a balanced approach to competition and also collaboration in space? Yeah, let's go reversed.
Do you want top 2 or top 3, or what did you say?
If you have 3, then I guess. Otherwise, 2 is enough.
Okay. We need to continue to set up standards of behavior so we know how to operate in space, to make sure that includes communication in space between objects to avoid those collisions. We need that transparency approach, I think, as well, so people have a better understanding of what is going on. And these things, I think, can move towards something legally in time. It won't be easy, but I think I certainly agree there needs to be given both sides in terms of recognizing the importance of access as well. And I think moving towards legally binding things in time, but I think there's a lot that we can do to pave the way for that, building on the foundational work that we already have. I'll stop there. Passing it around.
I'm not a consultant, so I'll offer all my recommendations for free. Yeah, I think continue to use, space diplomacy as a tool of prestige and soft power, and don't get into competitive sort of political arena. Use it as an instrument of international development. Support, development of space programs among nascent countries that have nascent space programs. Promote more of business in science and tech. I think we need to have, of course, a better mechanism in terms of governance of, space as global commons, all of that. I think we also need to just start doing what we're doing in the economic diplomacy domain. Invest in infrastructure of countries which don't have ample space programs. right? I think that's really the key. It's not about just being investing capital in countries that don't have adequate capital or adequate infrastructure. It's also investing capital in space programs, because really, if digital economy and e-commerce is all that we are going to be looking at in the future, it's important that everybody has that infrastructure. It's important to become a stakeholder in Asia's space delivery, mechanisms, and it's important to have more people like, the Director General of Space Agency, UAE Space Agency, at many of the other forums, and also have a space scientist in the Foreign Ministry, like we have in the UAE, who serves as an Assistant Minister for Advanced Science and Technology. I think it's such a key factor. Last but not the least, perhaps we should start thinking in terms of having an ambassador in space or an ambassador on space in some form.
Well, great. Thank you very much for all of the great, thoughts on this. I will echo most of them. I would add only, we have to recognize the important and effective, international, work done at the UN level. We have to recognize the open-ended working group on space, threats, norms, and rules. It's essential for promoting the responsible and sustainable use of space internationally, and that's an important factor. We still have to work on promoting transparency and trust among everybody. That will hopefully lead the way for more collaboration, more transfer of knowledge and education and technology, establishing guidelines for doing so, establishing the norms of doing so. And I need to also point out that in the MENA region we're seeing this. Just last year Oman has published this strategy on space, and it's recognized that it can't do everything itself, but it did point out that there is room for the private sector. And it's identified an area, a Dugum area, for a future commercial spaceport that is going to be served for the region. This is what we need to see more of. We need to see partners that can step up and take, hand in hand, these good initiatives that are going on in the region.
Thank you. I agree with all the different points. I would like to add something about human capital. I do think that it's crucial to invest, especially in countries where we need to invest more in terms of helping to support education in STEMs, and at the same time, ignite. I think it's very important to show that there are a lot of opportunities related to space activities, whether they are technology or diplomacy, policy, and young people are very, very interested in space, and they are really enthusiastic. And definitely, it will be a waste if we don't build on their enthusiasm and also the willingness to study, even in very difficult situations, anything that has to do with space. So that is, I think, it's important to invest more in that. In terms of the private sector, of course, when we talk about actors, we have governments, multilateral agencies, space agencies, private sector. So these are all crucial partners, and they have to work together, because especially in space, those partnerships are crucial not only for security purposes, but also because space is a critical infrastructure nowadays. So whether or not, even space weather has an impact on some of the critical infrastructure, and we depend on that. So we should keep in mind that. And awareness is very important. So I would say there are platforms for crisis management, deconfliction, and of incidents in space, because incidents happen not only because there are weapons, but could happen because of debris or other issues, and exchange of information. Standardization, I think, is a very important point. And then think about that, we are talking about the moon, but next is the cislunar orbit. We have to preserve it. And then, of course, there's other celestial bodies. and we shouldn't rush. We should do things when we are ready to do it. In that case, I would say the private sector sometimes has to be contained, even though they are very successful. But anyway, it's important to build a partnership, both the local level, domestic level, international level, and with the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on that, there was a lot of food for thought here. I wrote a very long list of recommendations. I did hear applause from other venues, so I think that's a cue that we will have to call this a day. But I would wish you could extend exactly to the excellent panelists. So thank you very much, and thank you, the audience, for your questions.